For being here. Usually it's that I'm the host, and I love the papers that I select, and I'm out here out of choice, but some of you I know have choice not to be here, and thank you very much for being here. I still think that we've got two lovely papers and then a rather intriguing session, and I think that you'll enjoy it. So without further ado, can I please invite Mark to present the paper, Watching the Wolves, Unveiling the Moderating Role of Corporate Governance CEO paper.
Thank you everyone for coming along. Thanks for making it to, I guess it's the penultimate session of the conference. And hopefully this will at least keep you awake for the next 15 minutes. So it's joint work with 3 other co-authors from UNSW as well. And basically what we're looking at in short is the role that improved corporate governance can have on helping to rein in powerful CEOs. And in particular, we're focusing on the exact ways in which that might happen. So powerful CEOs have been documented to potentially not create value, at least in some contexts. So if you've been following the takeover literature, and I know we've had a couple of presentations on takeovers, powerful CEOs are documented to be associated with value destruction in takeovers. In part, that can be due to entrenchment and managers acting self-interestedly. In part, it can also be due to them perhaps exerting less effort than would be optimal. That is, a powerful CEO, by becoming entrenched, doesn't need to exercise as much effort as they would otherwise need to do. So there can be potentially suboptimal investments across myriad fields. This can lead to overinvestment in takeovers, overinvestment in CapEx, or potentially, if the powerful CEO is investing excessively in safe empire-building types of investments, underinvestment in things such as R&D. So the question is then, how could you perhaps mitigate that? How could you perhaps get powerful CEOs to act more in shareholders' best interests, potentially by improving corporate governance? Now, what we focus on is the role of independent directors. Now, independent directors are relevant globally. In the United States, they became relevant around, for example, the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the NYSE NASDAQ listing rules. They're also relevant in other countries which don't have those same requirements. And I'll come to the exact requirements we look at in a second, but they're relevant in terms of how you would discipline powerful CEOs. So in particular, we're focusing on the board of directors, and in particular, we're focusing on independent directors and the extent to which independent directors could engage in additional oversight of powerful CEOs. Now, independent directors are worth focusing on because independent directors are potentially less co-opted by executives. They're potentially more able and more willing to exercise independent oversight of CEOs. They might also force the CEO to consider independent perspectives on how to run the company. That is, they force the CEO to consider fresh perspectives on managing the firm. This can potentially mitigate the impact of having a powerful CEO. Now, the key issue, of course, is that board independence is endogenous. That is, there can be an endogenous link between the extent to which a firm has an independent board and the presence of a powerful CEO, especially if that powerful CEO can impact the selection of executives or impact the selection of directors. So in order to get at that, or in order to get around that rather, we focus on the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the simultaneous changes to NYSE and NASDAQ listing rules, which basically force firms to have overall a majority independent directors, a fully independent audit committee, fully independent nominating committee. Those are the key provisions we focus on. Now, this forces firms to have greater board independence, and in so doing, it could force firms to have additional oversight of powerful CEOs. Now, effectively, what we want to look at is for the firms that didn't already have an independent board. They would be forced to have an independent board after the passage of these acts. So that is, there's a difference in difference type setup here, right? In that you've got a set of firms that didn't previously have an independent board, and those firms needed to come into compliance after the passage of these acts. Or passage these regulations, rather. And then you have the set of firms that already had an independent board. Now, this set of firms didn't need to change their board structure necessarily after the passage of the legislation and after the changes to the listing rules. So you end up with a set of firms that could be affected, a set of firms that might not be affected. Now, this in the United States occurred in 2002 and to a lesser extent 2003. Now, in other countries, they don't have the same types of rules, for example. So other countries don't necessarily mandate board independence, and as a result, other countries might want to look at to what extent, if at all, has this been beneficial. In the United States, there's a continued debate over whether Sarbanes-Oxley Act and these listing rules were beneficial. So this examination helps to feed into whether these changes were actually useful to firms. And this is particularly a key topic because there's been papers that have shown that firms have been less interested in listing on the US market following these additional governance changes. And now, in terms of Sarbanes-Oxley Act, some prior literature has shown that it has been beneficial in some specific contexts. So, for example, it has been potentially beneficial in reining in overconfident CEOs. Now, an overconfident CEO is not necessarily a powerful CEO. They're two quite different constructs. So it's been beneficial in some contexts in reining in some types of CEOs. We would expect that it might be beneficial, for the reasons I've already indicated, in helping to rein in powerful CEOs as well. That's effectively what we're looking at in this paper. Now, as I've indicated before, Sarbanes-Oxley Act affected a subset of firms. It affected the subset of firms that didn't previously have an independent board of directors. This enables us to distinguish between compliant and non-compliant firms. That is, the compliant firms were the ones that already had this independent board along the lines I've discussed, and the non-compliant ones were those that didn't have this independent board. Now, for the tests I'm going to report in the presentation, I'm going to focus on the impact of SOX for the non-compliant firms. In additional tests that I'm not presenting just for the purposes of time, we also do a difference in difference test where we're comparing the impact of SOX for compliant versus non-compliant firms with and without powerful CEOs. Now that's in the paper. I'll focus on the more simple to read slides or tables for this presentation. So basically our model specification is we focus on effectively S&P 1500 firms, and we focus on them between 1990 and 2014. Now the reason we focus on those types of firms is these are the firms for which we can get executive characteristics. For example, we can get characteristics on CEOs, option compensation, and stock compensation. And we can get that from a database called ExecuComp. So this gives us a richer data set by looking at the S&P 1500. There's no reason to suspect the results wouldn't hold in smaller companies. By looking at the bigger ones, we can get a better access to data. Now, in terms of how we're measuring CEO power, we're measuring that by effectively constructing an index based on several characteristics. So, for example, whether the CEO is a founder, CEO chair duality, title concentration, that is how many titles that CEO has, whether the tenure is above the industry median, and whether the CEO's ownership is above the industry median. Now, each of these individually can capture different constructs, of course. So, for example, CEO tenure in and of itself could capture CEO skill in terms of being able to maintain their job. The purpose of having the index, of course, is to try and triangulate factors that will increase CEO power when put together. We also construct an indicator for whether the CEO's power is in that top quartile. Now, in terms of our general specification, we're basically looking at the impact of CEO power as moderated by Sarbanes-Oxley Act on various dependent variables. So I've indicated our general regression framework on the slide here. As I've also talked about, we use a difference in difference type of test to compare compliant versus non-compliant firms. Now, in the slides that I'm going to be focusing on, we're just looking at this model in the set of firms that didn't already comply with Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The reason for that is these are the firms that actually have to make governance changes. So therefore, they're the firms that will need to change governance around this 2002 change to regulations. For the firms that were previously compliant, they didn't need to make any changes. You wouldn't expect them to have an impact. We do test that in other results. So in terms of the key research questions, we're basically looking at, broadly speaking, does an improvement in governance help to reduce the overinvestment that these powerful CEOs might be doing? And by overinvestment, I mean investment in things that don't create corporate value. So that could involve factors such as takeovers that destroy value. And we're going to look at that across multiple contexts, or constructs rather. So the first thing that we really focus on is R&D. Now, as I've indicated, a powerful CEO potentially will underinvest in R&D. The reason they might underinvest in R&D is due to at least one of two reasons. Firstly, a powerful CEO might realize that empire building could be a way to improve their future job prospects. That follows a paper by Harford and Schonlau that shows that basically continued investment in empire building seems to improve your future job prospects whether or not it actually creates value. So empire building could be attractive to a powerful CEO. Now, that would involve investments in things such as CapEx, investments in things such as takeovers, as opposed to investments in R&D, which might be risky and might have a more uncertain payoff. So we'd expect they might underinvest for that reason. An alternative reason is following Bertrand and Muller-Nathan in 2003. Basically, they find that entrenched CEOs might underinvest in risky investments because they might simply not want to exert the effort that's required. As a function of either of these two constructs, you would expect that powerful CEOs might underinvest in R&D. So the first test we're looking at is the impact of CEO power, Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and their interaction on the amount that firms invest in R&D in each year. Now, what we would expect is that after Sarbanes-Oxley Act, for the firms that weren't previously compliant with its provisions, these firms would start to invest more in R&D. That doesn't necessarily tell you that it's value creating, but it tells you they might be investing more in innovation. So that's effectively what we're looking at here. Now, the key thing that's of relevance here is the interaction term between our Sarbanes-Oxley Act variable, which captures basically just an indicator for the passage of the law, with our CEO power variables. And what we would expect is a positive and significant coefficient, which is what we find. As I indicated, that doesn't tell you that there's value creation. So hence we look at, after that, is this R&D that might actually be creating innovation outputs, not just investment in innovation inputs. So in order to look at innovation outputs, we also look at several ways that innovation could be beneficial to a firm. And we're looking at not just do they invest more in R&D, but does that have tangible impacts for a firm? So we look at that in terms of patent outputs, citations, and the value of this innovation. Now, the market value of innovation is obviously a tricky one to get at. It highly correlates with how many citations the patents actually accrue. So in order to get at that, again, we run a similar regression framework, and we're looking at the number of patents the firm has in year T plus 2 as a function of, again, CEO power, the passage of Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and the interaction thereof. Now, in terms of patents and citations, these powerful CEOs after Sarbanes-Oxley Act, they're generating more patents and more citations than they were beforehand. They are also generating, their patents, or rather, are also having a higher market value after Sarbanes-Oxley Act than they were beforehand, suggesting that the R&D that they might be doing seems to be creating more value than it was before, which seems to imply that improved governance might be leading not just to improvements in the amount that's invested on innovation inputs, but also an improvement in those innovation outputs, which is a key factor associated with whether R&D is actually creating value. So it isn't necessarily just an increase in expenditure, but an increase in the value created by that expenditure. Now that's useful. That has a key intuition behind it, rather, in that there's a key intuition for why improved governance should improve R&D outputs, improve innovation outputs. And that can come from the need to consider outside views on whether that R&D will actually create value. It can also come from the increased discipline that will be required when making that R&D investment. So it would appear to create a degree of value for these firms. The next thing, of course, to look at is, in terms of R&D, they might be investing more in R&D. And as I indicated before, one of the key concerns is that a powerful CEO might overinvest in less innovative investments that create less long-term value. Some of those less innovative investments, rather, could be CapEx growth or PP&E growth, so property, plant, and equipment growth. Those might not create value because they're less innovative, they seem to have less correlation to long-term value creation in the firm, and they are potentially a greater source of empire building for these firms. So the question is, could you reduce that expenditure in fixed assets, and as I've indicated, maybe shift it toward R&D, or at least shift it towards something that will create value? So the next test that we're looking at here is, after Sarbanes-Oxley Act, do powerful CEOs seem to invest less in CapEx and grow property, plant, and equipment by less than they were beforehand, which would potentially suggest a reduction in empire building. Now, that's effectively what we're finding here with this double interaction term. The powerful CEOs after Sarbanes-Oxley Act seem to invest less in CapEx, so that the CapEx growth becomes lower, and their PP&E growth also seems to decline. So that is, they are growing both by less than they were beforehand. And as I sort of alluded to, powerful CEOs, as you can kind of see from the coefficient on CEO power by itself, they do seem to be growing CapEx and PP&E more in general, but that reduces after Sarbanes-Oxley Act, suggesting an increase in oversight might help to rein in what they're spending. Now, that doesn't necessarily tell you there's value creation. That is, it's not necessarily beneficial if they reduce CapEx and reduce PP&E growth, but they aren't shifting that into something that's value creating. Or alternatively, if they just cut back on all investment, that might not generate value. So the next thing to look at is in terms of the market announcement returns around the investments in these new innovations, or new investments rather. So what we've got here is value creation around product announcements, and we're looking at the market's reaction to that value, to those product announcements, in terms of the cumulative abnormal return around the product announcement. And we also look at an indicator for whether that cumulative abnormal return is in the top quartile. Now, if reducing CapEx is actually beneficial, then you would expect these CARs, the cumulative abnormal returns, to get better after Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which is effectively what we're finding here. After Sarbanes-Oxley Act, powerful CEOs' investment announcements do create more value. We also look at that in terms of acquisitions, and again, we're looking at the cumulative abnormal return around acquisition announcements. Again, if powerful CEOs are reducing empire building after Sarbanes-Oxley Act, these CARs should get better. That is, that would reflect a reduction in empire building, which is exactly what we're finding. Powerful CEOs' takeovers create more value after Sarbanes-Oxley Act than they were before, suggesting again a reduction in empire building. Finally, what we look at is if they're spending less on some of these investments, spending less on CapEx, spending less on PP&E, are they just hoarding that as a cash stockpile, which if you followed Jared Harford's papers, that wouldn't be beneficial, or are they paying it out? And what we're finding here is they are potentially paying it out in the form of dividends. So after Sarbanes-Oxley Act, powerful CEOs seem to be paying more dividends than they were before, suggesting that instead of hoarding cash, they're paying it back to shareholders, which itself is more beneficial than just sitting on a cash stockpile for no necessary corporate reason. So just to summarize this paper, what this paper effectively looks at is powerful CEOs and the extent to which improvements in corporate governance could help to rein in potentially value destruction in powerful CEOs. What we find is that after there's an exogenous shock to board independence, powerful CEOs seem to invest less, but when they're investing, it seems to create more value. They do more innovation. The innovation seems to generate more outputs, and the takeovers seem to create more value when you get this forced improvement in corporate governance. So thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I'll now pass it back over to my discussant to continue on with it.
For the sort of very good presentation. So actually the title is what really woke me up. So watching the wolf, so there is an undercurrent that, if I interpret it correctly, that CEOs are sort of akin to wolves in some sense, but we don't want to take it too far, and some of my discussion would be based on that. So it was, I really enjoyed reading the paper, and basically, this is an area where I'm also sort of getting interested in, and CEO power and has been under increasing focus also in the academic literature, and there are a bunch of papers which are looking at it, and so this really fits into that field of research. So my focus of my discussion, and Susan has given me 10 minutes, I want to finish it in 10 minutes, is that while the presentation has focused much more on the results and the sort of the later part of the paper, my discussion would be on the sort of the first half of the paper, before all the estimation really starts, in terms of the story and the motivation and the framework. Okay, so this is, so I just sort of organize my discussion into the core idea as I've understood it, the conceptual issues, and some measurement issues. So the core idea, as you could sort of understand, is that CEO power impacts performance through various corporate outcomes, such as innovation, capital expenditure, merger and acquisition deals, etc. Extant literature, basically, although the paper is like watching the wolves, if you look at the literature, there are positive and benefits, positive effects and negative effects of CO power. Okay, okay, yeah, I can get there. Here there is this supposition that, CO power is bad, but if you really look at the empirical literature, the evidence is mixed as to whether CO power necessarily has only negative effects. So we, just to keep it in perspective, there are positive and negative effects of CO power, and the other point that the paper says is the CO power and corporate outcomes may be endogenously related, and also that, sort of the CEO has CEO has sort of a power in choosing the independent board. So the identification strategy that has been used in the paper is to sort of bring in an exogenous shock on corporate governance variables in terms of change in board composition and independent audit committees due to the enactment of SOX, which leads to strong corporate governance, which exogenously impacts CEO power, which impacts corporate outcomes. So the paper basically says that stronger CG due to SOX can actually channelize all these negative energies of CEO power or a powerful CEO into better outcomes. And it is measured through comparing the post-SOX effect of CEO power on outcomes in pre-SOX compliant and non-compliant firms. So here, let me just tell you how I understood the word compliant and non-compliant firms. By reading the paper, it was sort of evident that compliance and non-compliance was defined in terms of whether firms voluntarily met the SOX, post-SOX requirements in the pre-SOX era. So it doesn't really mean that the firms that were sort of there pre-SOX were non-compliant in terms of the current regulations or the current laws. So it essentially says that which are the firms which sort of complied with the post-SOX requirements before SOX was passed. So that is the compliant. And the non-compliant, as I understood, was those which did not meet the post-SOX requirements, but could be compliant, right, to NYSE regulations at that time. So changes in CG in compliant firms does not change the effect of CEO power, according to the paper, whereas in non-compliant firms, CEO power is channelized productively through stronger CG post-SOX into better outcomes. So you have to think about a pre-SOX and a post-SOX. Pre-SOX compliant firms are those who have voluntarily actually over-complied at that point of time, and the non-compliant are actually compliant, but they did not sort of meet or voluntarily meet the post-SOX requirements. Okay, so the conceptual issue that I have is this. So if I look at the first part here, this is what the paper wants to say, that this is a SOX and exogenous shock on internal firm governance. And so here is SOX, and then majority independent directors, which impact CEO power, and then corporate policies. This part, this is the way I sort of question it, in the sense that, okay, fine, SOX leads to a majority independent directors and independent audit committee, and then this is the part where I have a problem. That when you say CEO power, the entire literature on CEO power is, and the paper also recognizes, is the power to choose the board members, right? So it can be technically an independent board, but how independent is it, right? So the question is that you have a list of requirements to say, this qualifies as independent director, this qualifies as independent director. But if you look at the literature, even in the post-SOX era, people are talking about the quality of independence. How would you define independence? So this does not necessarily mean that just because the board became majority independent directors, a powerful CEO, the way it is defined in terms of CEO tenure and founding family member, etc., it really can constrict it, but doesn't take away the power. So the causality here actually breaks down. So I think the authors should focus on this a little bit to understand that this is a literature that actually has not been cited in the paper about the quality of independence and not necessarily tick mark compliance to board independence, okay? So while composition of board exogenously determined by SOX, but quality of board independence can be influenced by CEO power. By definition, you're saying CEOs are powerful. So one would expect that. And if you look at some of the literature, one is Westphal and Zazek, that essentially powerful CEOs can influence the composition of the board. The study period here is 92 to 2014. It's pretty long, okay? So now you know that if you look at the work by Mark and some work from social psychology literature, that independent board, so you can technically have an independent board where the CEO is not connected with the members. But over time, what happens is, if you say the CEOs are the wolves, the CEOs are also trying to figure out how to influence those who are watching over him, okay? So, and there's a social psychology literature which says that the committee members start thinking like the CEOs. So the point here is that I think the paper has to focus on that aspect much more to motivate what they are looking at than just to say that, okay, SOX had this shock, it's a source of shock to board composition. The other thing is that the endogeneity gets exacerbated by long horizon outcomes. You're having R&D, you're having M&A, all of these are long horizon outcomes. And you think about the shock which happened in 2002, and then to say that the CEO continues to sort of be getting watched over without any change in the quality of independence or nature of independence, especially when tenure is one of the components of CEO power, I think we have to think about it. Okay. The other one is that the presentation sort of focused only on the non-compliant firms. So I want to just focus my my observations on compliant and non-compliant firms. So compliant firms are voluntarily compliant, so this is how the paper has defined. Now, paper sort of assumes this one-to-one correspondence between voluntary over-compliance, which I call, and better governance. If you look at the literature on independent directors, board independence, firm outcomes, anything, it is inconclusive. It is not that just because you have more independent directors on a board means that the outcomes are better. So there is this paper called non-relationship between board independence and firm outcomes. So I think this is, again, a literature that the authors should focus on. So there's this leap of faith, and there is this statement in the paper that over-compliant firms are actually better governed firms. So I start with that assumption, and then I proceed with the estimations. I think, again, some thought has to be given here. So non-compliance, compliance defined with respect to SOX. So this is a point I have already made. So more independent directors, suppose I'm giving you a scenario. So a board has more independent directors pre-SOX. Does not necessarily mean higher quality of governance. It could be all of these directors in the pre-SOX areas were essentially connected directors, okay? So, so the need to demonstrate with some summary stats. So if you're talking about compliant and non-compliant, I didn't find a table in the paper which essentially compares the compliant and non-compliant firms in terms of board characteristics, performance, R&D, all the variables that you've taken into account. I think we should have a table, and then maybe we can say, okay, those who over-complied on an average were performing better or had better outcomes as compared to the non-compliant ones. So need to demonstrate this. So are better firms compliant or non-compliant? I don't know. I didn't get the answer, basically, other than the statement that compliant firms are assumed to be better governed. So just the last two slides. Measurement issue. Here, as the presentation shows, that essentially you're focusing on this interaction term between CEO power and SOX, and you're doing this, running this regression for compliant firms and non-compliant firms, and the interaction term is positive and significant in non-compliant firms and has no effect on compliant firms. That's, again, my understanding. So here I have one observation that, we talk, the paper talks a lot about audit committees, board independence, etc. But all that we are doing in terms of a shock is just dummy variable SOX. So can we think about explicitly incorporating some of these CG variables into the estimation framework to give us a better view of what essentially better estimation of the effects. Last, a thought experiment. So here, again, that leap of faith story, what I'm saying, the paper assumes pre-SOX compliant is better than pre-SOX non-compliant, right? So the non-compliant, suppose I say pre-SOX outcome was 10, and post-SOX outcome is 13. So better CG incentivizes really powerful but bad CEOs to take optimal decisions. Compliant, pre-SOX outcome is 15, they're already doing great, and post-SOX compliant outcome is also 15. You don't need to change because you're doing great, and CEO power already optimal. Conclusion is therefore SOX has positive effect on poorly governed firms. Now suppose I consider an alternative scenario, given also that I didn't find any data in this, that the pre-SOX non-compliant is better than the pre-SOX compliant. It is quite possible that the pre-SOX non-compliant were actually the optimal firms which were making the optimal choices, and pre-SOX compliant, that the over-compliance was actually inoptimal in the pre-SOX period. It is quite possible, right? If that is the case, it is possible that this is a scenario. If this is a scenario, then the non-compliant, suppose I assume pre-SOX outcome is 10, post-SOX outcome is 13, but the non-compliant is actually the better guys, okay? So better CG then incentivizes powerful CEOs to further take better decisions. So I can do that, and the compliant, which were like really, just, sort of over-complying essentially, and being optimal, possibly, suppose there is no change. So those are the ones where whatever, there could be characteristics of these firms which are actually worse than the compliant firm, non-compliant firms. So similar result, but you see now the conclusion is reversed. So I'll say SOX has positive effect on better governed firms with powerful CEOs and no effect on poorly governed firms. So the crux of this entire paper rests with this assumption that over-compliance is good, which I'm questioning, and I think the authors can focus and motivate better as to why it is good by running some regressions, looking at some of the data, make a case, and then proceed to all the estimations that you have done later. So essentially, and the author said that they have done a difference in difference, and we can, you can just essentially try it with, the time effects of the two. If the time effects of the two are different, and the differences in compliant and non-compliant firms are different, they are two different animals, then we can try a different diff to figure out what is happening. So essentially a very interesting paper, and I really hope to see it published and contribute to this sort of growing literature on CEO power and firm outcomes, and thank you. And I think I almost made it.
We have time for just a few questions. Anjali, of course. No? Okay, Anjali, go. We're running over.
I'm just asking for a clarification. It's not. So my understanding of SOX is that the channel through which it improves governance is by seeking better records and better record keeping, right? Which is that you have to maintain your records in a certain form and quality over a certain period of time, and you have to certify that your records are correct as stated, and if you're found to be in violation, then your key personnel, etc., can be penalized or sent to jail. I'm not entirely certain how it links, this description of the corporate governance channel links to the issue of CEO power. So are we saying that powerful CEOs do not or wish to, what do they wish to do with this SOX compliance? Because SOX is not about more independent directors, or it's more about the quality of the accounting and the record keeping, etc. At least that's my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, so slightly different question. I mean, and I think if we're putting the Indian or Asian hat also onto it, for most of the firms, and I saw that mentioned, CEO ownership's only 3%. So in general, these are not firms where the CEOs are the large shareholders. And what I did not see mentioned at all in this presentation is the influence of shareholder-directors. Actually, I mean, the issue of corporate governance and the issue of the agency issue here is management and shareholders are now divided, and the board in theory is representing shareholders. What happens when there are non-independent but non-executive directors on the board, right? And to what extent do they make any difference in these results? Because that, to be honest, is a challenge which exists in many of the emerging markets also, right? And the impact of the CEO having a larger shareholding versus not having a larger shareholding as an additional element on variability. I think now activist investors are beginning to push themselves onto board to make sure shareholders come onto boards. But that is a very different group of people because they're not subservient by definition to the CEO. They're not chosen by the CEO. And I guess the linked question around that is the impact of NRCs. To what extent are, so the NRC is the nomination committee which actually is responsible for choice of independence over time on boards. To what extent have they had a role to play in terms of ensuring this feedback loop between CEO and independence is managed and the impact and performance of such?
Okay, would you like to respond?
Yeah, thank you so much for the discussion, and thank you so much for the questions as well. I'll try and respond really briefly, just in broad terms. It will be probably useful to bring in the quality of directors into the regressions. We can get, at least to some extent, information on that quality, and I think that will be important to bring in. In terms of whether overcompliance in the pre-SOX period is optimal, we don't necessarily have a huge amount to say on that per se. All we need is that potentially an improvement in board independence is beneficial, potentially in some contexts. In terms of whether it was beneficial beforehand or not, to the extent that's relevant, that would be captured actually in our year effects. The reason that would be captured in year effects is that the impact of, say, board independence will be effectively a constant in that prior period. So effectively, we just need to look at the impact of the change of that on a particular set of CEOs. The other question was in relation to the impact of SOX. You're right that SOX did have a whole lot of broader changes in terms of reporting and all of those types of changes. Those are relevant and they're important. For our purposes, they're difficult to examine. The reason I say that is they're constant for all firms, so we don't really have a set of firms that suddenly needed to come into compliance with those. So they could be beneficial for everyone, but we're not able to test that necessarily because they would just look at the 2002 dummy, which could just be a time effect. Hence why we focus on the impact of boards. Those could still be relevant factors, but we haven't focused on those as opposed to needing a majority independent board and also needing the fully independent audit committee and fully independent nominating committee. But that point is very well taken. It's also well taken that we could look at shareholder-directors and at least the impact of activist investors and institutional shareholders. We haven't really done that so far, but we can at the very least control for that more in the regressions. So thank you so much for the comments. They've all been very helpful.
Thank you. And now